Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for taking the time to join us today for our webcast, Closing the Access Loop, Effective Techniques to Manage Your Segregation of Duties and Sensitive Access. My name is Jamie Draper. I'm a partner with PricewaterhouseCoopers in the SAP practice, focusing on security controls and GRC. I'm joined today by Scott Osterman and Jonathan Levitt, who I'll do a little bit more of an introduction in a minute. I want to welcome you to this webcast. We're looking to put on a series of webcasts focusing on topics around security and controls. We did an initial webcast and got a lot of positive feedback, and now we're looking to put on these topics about sort of 6 during the year, and I'll cover a little bit more of that later and would welcome any feedback on what topics you'd like us to hear. I'm going to go through some administrative matters to start with, and then we'll get going with the presentation. First, we have a disclaimer that I need to read out. This is particularly relevant to anybody who's joining from one of our audit clients. And I'm just going to read this exactly as it is. Certain matters reviewed today may represent services that PwC may be prohibited from providing to our audit clients. In those instances, the information is being provided to inform you of options that you may consider as you assess your company's approach to managing segregation of duties and sensitive access. Independence rules are complex, and we recommend to discuss all services with you in advance within the context of the independence rules. The information contained in this document is provided as is for general guidance on matters of interest only. PricewaterhouseCoopers is not herein engaged in rendering legal, accounting, tax, or other professional advice and services. Before making any decisions or taking any action, you should consult a competent professional advisor. And then the copyright. So if we move on, just to quickly go through some of the administrative procedures for today's webcast. The first two, very much just to enhance your viewing and audio capability. Please close all other applications. Better sound quality is to use headphones. And then to enlarge the slides, click on the bottom right corner of the slide and drag to the desired size, or click the maximize button at the top right of the slide window. One of the questions we get asked whenever we do these webcasts is whether the slides are available. We've made the slides available to you. Click on the resources widget at the bottom of the screen, and you should be able to download today's presentation. Questions, we really encourage you to submit questions throughout the presentation. I'll answer any that are relevant during the presentation, but we'll probably tee them up at the end. And any that we don't get to, we'll answer via email later on. So please submit questions as they come to mind as we go through the topic. There's a Q&A window on the left side of your screen where you can do that. And last, if you're experiencing technical difficulties during the polling sessions, please reply to the questions in the Q&A window. And the final note on administrative procedures, there is a CPE credit available for today's webcast. You must stay on the presentation for the entire 60 minutes. You have to respond to the polling questions. There will be 4 of those polling questions that I'll read out. You need to click the CPE widget on conclusion of the webcast located at the bottom of the screen and follow the prompts to download the certificate. And then lastly, the CPE cannot be awarded if you're not logged onto the webcast as yourself. You can't get CPE if you're a phone participant, and you can't get CPE if it's the on-demand version. So that's it for administrative procedures. As we get into the presentation, as I mentioned earlier, I'm joined today by Scott Osterman, who's a fellow partner within the SAP practice. Scott leads our security practice and has extensive experience implementing security and implementing GRC access controls, as well as extended programs to integrate security with identity and access management solutions. So very, very happy to have Scott on the line. He's joining us from Russia, where he's actively engaged on a project right now. I'm also joined by Jonathan Levitt, who's here with me. Jonathan is a manager within the group, also focused on security and security. Jonathan is responsible for pulling together materials today and works very closely with both Scott and myself on a number of projects. And I think I've seen the attendee list, and there's a few folks on that we've had the pleasure of working with, so thank you for that. I will hand over now to Scott, who's going to go through the agenda. Scott.
Great. Thank you very much, Jamie, and thank you, everybody, for joining. As Jamie was saying, we're going to have John Levitt take us through a lot of the detail, but I first wanted to go through agenda, a little bit of an introduction to today's webcast on closing the access loop. So from an agenda perspective, we're going to just first go through an initial introduction. I'll talk a little bit about what to expect as we go through the webcast and the detail that you should expect to get. Basically, the plan is here to take you through a life cycle of segregation of duties management from the beginning of identifying the risks that you want to be tracking, the sensitivity of those risks, and how you would build it into a system to analyze that, whether that is some sort of GRC system, a homegrown system, whatever that may be. And through that life cycle, as you identify the risks that are out there and in segregation of duties cases you want to look for, we then jump into remediation and mitigation strategies. And there's a number of different ways to tackle remediation, a number of different approaches, risk-based approaches that may be taken, as well as applying mitigations. From there, following the life cycle, we'll go through continuous compliance and what that means and the governance that goes with continuous compliance, and conclude with a bit of a case study, some of the things that we've seen working in the industry, working with our clients, working with many of you that are on the line as well. As we go through the actual introduction, as I was saying, the life cycle of segregation of duties and continuous compliance here, really what we want to provide, so at the end of the webinar you can expect to have a really good understanding of the various techniques and practices that would help you ensure completeness of what you're testing for. So one of the most important aspects of the segregation of duties effort is that the data for which you're using to evaluate segregation of duties and sensitive access is the right information, because everything is going to be based off that foundation. You want to make sure that the rule set is complete, it's accurate, it's aligned with the risks for your organization. And Jonathan will talk through a lot of that in great detail. And then moving on with how to minimize the introduction of segregation of duties through a monitoring and preventative process, both of which will apply. And then we'll talk a little bit about how the differences across the rule sets would factor into an automated provisioning solution, a little bit different from the reporting side, but more about how it plays into a true continuous compliance, very efficient, automated process for managing access in your system. When you think about the benefits that come from this type of effort around segregation of duties, there's some of the obvious ones. There's reducing the audit issues that may arise, and reducing the violations that are out there, reducing exposure to the risk associated with segregation of duties violations existing out there. But it's more than just that. There's the ability to reduce costs of compliance, making the reports available to people on demand, whether that's part of the business, reviewing the access that their users or the people that report to them have, whether that's internal audit, whether that's a compliance group. They're reports that are complete, they're accurate, they're meaningful. They're not something where you're trying to really filter through to figure out what is actually accurate, what is truly access that users have versus based off of maybe bad data or based off of a rule set that wasn't complete for your organization. So those are some of the things that you look to get out of initial efforts around rule set. We also look at efficiencies. So you can look at that as a cost savings, but you can also look at it as true efficiencies in terms of how users get the access, how automated it is, how involved IT has to be versus how much it can be driven through the business and through technology. So we'll talk about the people, process, and technology aspect of that, which again would lead into some of the cost savings from a good maintenance process and governance procedures. So those are just some of the benefits that you'll hear about, and we'll definitely share some examples of what we've seen over the last years in terms of the evolution of the products that are out there, the amount of information that can be leveraged, and the level of detail reporting and accuracy that can be gained from the technology to really drive good processes and a secure, compliant environment. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John Levitt, and he's really going to dive into the details for the rest of the webcast. John?
Thanks, Scott. So firstly, I wanted to give you an introduction into segregation of duties and sensitive access. Audit standards and regulations do not typically dictate specific SOD or SA requirements. However, maintaining a system of effective control from an access perspective does require appropriate separation of duties. This separation really should not only be considered from a regulatory control perspective, but also as it supports the effort to minimize the risk of undetected error, limit the opportunities of fraudulent actions or malicious damage. So in terms of that, what does kind of separation mean? From my perspective, it is that the implementation of rules based on segregation of duties and sensitive access risks. So segregation of duties being the division of an ability to perpetrate and conceal basically two incompatible duties that when assigned to one individual present an access risk, kind of providing the ability for a user to perpetrate either the fraudulent, malicious or erroneous activities. And then there's sensitive access, and this is the direct assignment of sensitive or privileged access. An ability that, if inappropriately assigned, presents an access risk. The objective really here, though, is to kind of monitor who has this access and whether or not it is appropriate. Okay, so examples of segregation of duties and sensitive access risks. As kind of displayed in the slide deck, a segregation of duties risk could be maintain accounting periods and post-accounting documents in the GL. So this would allow a user to open the period and basically post fraudulent documents after month end, thereby concealing the transaction. Alternatively, we could have maintaining core employee data against payment-related data. And these two abilities within the system would allow a user to fraudulently amend the pay of an employee, for example. So, and then from a sensitive access perspective, we have here post-accounting documents to the GL. So this is monitoring whether the end user assigned this ability are appropriate and thereby reduce the risk of inappropriate journal entries being created. Another one, for example, assigning roles or access to end users. So this could mean that if assigned inappropriately, it could result with the excessive access being provisioned and utilized to actually create users or assign access for fraudulent or malicious purposes. So basically, overall, it is important here to kind of address both segregation of duties and sensitive access in order to achieve kind of appropriate separation, and therefore kind of effectively minimizing the system access risk.
Yeah, and John, just to add to that as well, one of the very common things we see is starting with a default or a delivered rule set, and those rule sets are phenomenal as starting points, but they can't be taken at face value because you really need to work through the customization to address your objectives. So those could be strictly financial related objectives. They could be operational control in nature. They could be a combination. But we need to make sure that they really do truly fit the business and the risk profile of the business. And that's an area where we see a lot of times where you can start off with too much information in terms of analyzing rules or segregation of duties issues that are not valid and made to your organization. So they could be instances where not tweaking it could give you false results or voluminous amounts of violations that you really have to go through that constrain the project and the efforts to actually go through it. So that's really why we focus on understanding what's truly a risk, what's the difference between segregation of duties and sensitive access, and really evaluate how it fits your organization.
Yeah. Okay, everybody, so here's our first CPE poll question. At your company, which tool is utilized to manage and monitor segregation of duties and sensitive access? Number 1, SAP-GRC access controls, access risk analysis, the ARA tool. Number 2, Approver 1. Number 3, an external third-party assessment. Number 4, another tool. And number 5, none, segregation of duties and sensitive access is not monitored. And we need to give a minute for everybody to answer this question. So I'll allow you a little bit of time to read this and go through. In the meantime, just a little bit, I think, if you haven't gathered already, both Jonathan and I are from the UK. We're sort of arguing about sports and things. I'm also from San Francisco, so go 49ers, or go Niners, I should say. Right now, it looks like we're showing that the majority of people use access control followed by an other tool. I think it's interesting. Okay, so the final results of that poll, I think we're just slightly ahead. It's SAP's GRC tool, which I think is probably what we would have expected to see the majority of companies using, followed by other tools. So I think there's probably a lot of people out there using a number of other tools. So Jonathan, if you want to go back to the presentation.
Thanks, Jamie. Okay, so this is where I want to introduce the methodology to basically get clean and stay clean, addressing the segregation of duties and sensitive access within your environment, the end objective being achieving continuous compliance. So this kind of methodology is broken into 3 phases and 6 steps. Phase 1, to identify the risk and converts that into a rule that can be utilized to report with. Phase 2, to analyze the segregation duties and sensitive access issues identified from the rule set build, and identify means in which to mitigate, basically address the residual risk of provision that access through another control, or remediate, which is basically to remove the violating access from the user. So then the final phase, phase 3, is basically establish the preventative and detective controls in order to sustain that continuous compliance. So the phase we'll walk through in this section is risk recognition, and then basically from that, how to tailor the reporting rules in an effort to support those identified risks. The risks should be tailored to consider vulnerabilities of the system from an access perspective, that basically open it up for fraudulent activity and whether exposure could result in material misstatements of financial statements. But the reason why customization is a necessity is to really ensure the accuracy and completeness of SOD and SA reporting, removing the false positives, items that are identified that are not a risk, and also the false negatives, which are items which are a risk that are not identified, which is probably more key. So basically, I mean, bear in mind that risks will differ in accordance with the size and complexity of the organization and the control environment. And also consideration must be given towards the purpose of the rule set. Does the organization only want to monitor risks for regulatory compliance? Or, for example, do you want to extend the rule set to monitor operational access within the system? This will all impact the customization phase. So the final element I want to touch upon is really the benefits. So with more accurate and complete reports, operational efficiencies are going to be achieved through reduced SOD-SA investigation times. And we have found that businesses will be more comfortable, or the business will be more comfortable with the reports. The results are clearer, more meaningful, which kind of based on my experience, results with increased ownership and involvement in remediation and mitigation activities. So There is a mention here of validation, and really kind of once basically the rules have been recognized and built, then you want to ensure that the segregation of duties and sensitive access risks are reporting all violation conflicts as designed. So the importance of this phase should not be overlooked. It basically tests and ensures appropriateness of the technical build. So a test plan really should be developed, testing each risk through the implementation of kind of targeted test rules to evaluate reporting accuracy.
And John, I think this slide really shows the fact that this truly is a process. It's when we look at this, it's an evolution in terms of how you would go through the process of getting from a get clean to a stay clean environment. And we like to look at it, and say we have to walk before we run. Well, that's exactly what this is. We need to understand what the risks are. We need to build around them, and then work on the process to get clean. Then leverage the continuous compliance, the governance, the automation, the tools, the new processes to maintain that compliance over time. So all of this goes into what will eventually be that end state, but it's not something that can be done generally in a very short period of time. It's usually a phased approach. It's something you really look at in terms of the manner in which it needs to be attacked, the issues that may be out there that need to be addressed, and the prioritization of those issues that will really drive how this is approached. It's hard to go in and put a continuous compliance structure in, so say automate existing processes. If there's a lot of existing violations and sensitive access, segregation of duties that exist in the environment, we're just speeding up the ability to grant more of those violations in the system. So we look at it as a process that evolves, and you really want to tailor it to meet what your objectives are. But it is truly important to understand that it's a journey.
Okay, thanks, Scott. So, yeah, so as we kind of highlighted, the overall objective of this initial phase is to identify the risks that are applicable to your organization. And to do this, I have found that the facilitation of workshops is probably the most effective approach, whereby risks are introduced to a group of individuals to discuss and decide upon whether they are A, applicable and relevant for the organization, and also whether whether there's some alternate factors as well that need to be kind of considered in terms of the risk ranking, which we'll go into in a minute. But I've found that kind of this approach, this workshop approach, incredibly collaborative. I'm pooling the knowledge and experience of multiple individuals to produce good discussion and therefore good results. But in terms of this risk workshop approach, there are kind of three principles that should be applied to kind of recognize these risks. And as you can see from the slide deck, the first one is compile your resources. So as a starting point, bring together a list of risks from multiple sources in order to introduce the workshop. For example, the standard rule set that comes with the tool, which we kind of mentioned earlier, this provides a great generic library which can be used to actually identify those risks. Also leverage existing documentation such as the SOD matrices that were once utilized to support the evaluation of SOD and SA. And the external auditors who kind of test the access to support their IT general control assessments. So, I mean, why not utilize them to understand what they test and why? Auditors kind of by and large understand the business in a way that facilitates practical control mechanisms. So try and utilize that knowledge. Basically, kind of the aim is to create a comprehensive list of risks. We have stressed on the slide deck not to overlook sensitive access. And although this is addressed throughout this presentation, we have experienced that this sometimes is not considered in terms of incorporation into the rule set. So the next element is really risk ranking. So you have now captured all your risks and during the workshops, together with assessing each risk's applicability. So the rank should be determined, and ranking tends to be broken down as either critical, high, medium, or low, or alternatively no risk, sorry. But the overall objective is to maintain consistency and support effective reporting. For example, critical may mean incredibly sensitive, high risk of enabling fraudulent or malicious activity and should never be granted to any users, whereby high could mean very sensitive, high risk of enabling, this fraudulent, malicious activity, but required for day-to-day responsibilities. So hence, it is required for a specific set of users. Whereby the alternative kind of definition is, for low, for example, this could mean simply operational risk. But however the rankings are defined, they should be agreed upon upfront and then consistently applied during these workshops and these assessments, and applied for each risk. Okay. The final element, is basically involve the right people. So as discussed earlier, you need to generate a knowledgeable and collaborative environment in order to achieve the most effective results from the workshop. And this should involve basically bringing together subject matter experts from, for example, the IT team, the internal control, and also the business. I believe more relevant experience and knowledge, the better it is for recognizing the access risk for your organization. This also, though, enables business participation early on in the process, increasing understanding and thereby facilitating the provision of valued support, in particular during the remediation, mitigation, and continuous compliance phases. So, basically, the purpose of kind of the next three stages I'm going to introduce is really to establish the technical rules to monitor the risks that have been defined. So once defined, break these risks. You need to break down these risks into kind of specific system abilities and agree on kind of a common language to specify the action. Is it create, change, modify, or maintain, for example? These need to be defined as well as identifying whether one action is more sensitive than another. As per the slide deck, for example, segregating purchase order activities may translate to any one of the following: create change purchase orders, create change purchase orders versus approve versus release purchase order, for example. There is no kind of right or wrong answer, so the recommended approach would be, during the risk recognition exercise or workshops, is to ensure that all parties agree on terminology and which functions or system abilities should be appropriately segregated or highlighted as sensitive. In this instance, do you care about approving a purchase order, or is release the critical component? This step is really critical to kind of ensure that the technical aspects of the rule set are defined properly. So moving on to the next element, which is, and the objective in this stage is to basically identify the transaction codes or system actions that enable for the ability to highlighted that constitute a risk. For example, to simply put it, the ability to post a document will be translated to transaction code FB01 in SAP. Just to stress here, though, that an ability to transaction code mapping is not a one-to-one relationship. One ability can be performed by multiple transactions. So the recommended approach for identifying your transaction code is really start with your sources. Again, the standard GRC rule set includes many transactions already, so utilize that as a starting point. Alternatively, if previous assessments have been performed, leverage that information. This may not be comprehensive, so this should be supplemented with technical specialists from both the IT and the business. Furthermore, when mapping kind of these abilities to transactions, don't simply consider transactions that are signed within your security role design. Kind of consider, everything that in terms of what's included in the system. This will really ensure kind of the longevity of the rule set. So the next element is kind of reviewing custom transaction codes for inclusion in the rule set. Custom transactions are built in the majority to basically accommodate for bespoke or tailored functionality within the system. The custom transactions that execute the ability are ability that constitutes a risk need to be incorporated within the rule set. So to identify these, the first step is to initially inventory the custom transactions, usually the Y or Z codes, and then to apply one or more of the following assessment techniques. So basically there's three of these techniques. The first one is to examine the documentation around the transaction, or investigate within the sandbox to determine the purpose of the functionality of that transaction, or alternatively determine whether or not they are parameter transactions, and these are standard transactions with pre-assigned values, so they perform basically the same abilities as the standard transactions. And then the final bit is leverage the change documents to determine if the custom transaction codes have changed or impact any of the key objects within the business module. So in essence, what you're attempting to do here is really identify those transaction codes that should be identified and included that constitute that ability. Okay, so I'm going to move on to a poll question. So, Jamie.
Yep. So our next poll question, our second poll question for the CPE. In your opinion, what is the most effective technique for assessing custom transaction codes and determining whether they should be included in the rule set? Answer 1, evaluating the functionality of each customized transaction. 2, determining whether or not they are parameter transactions for any of the standard transactions in your rule set. 3, utilizing change documents to determine if the custom transactions have impacted any critical objects. Or 4, a mixture of the above. And whilst we're going through and letting you read that and answer that question, I'm going to address some of the questions that have come in on the through the website. One question just generally was about, can we give the population for the poll questions to give a sense of how many people are voting? We don't actually right now see the number of people that have voted. There are 900 people on the webcast, so even if you take 50% of that, I would say that it's a pretty large representation that we're getting back of the poll questions. Another question that came in, I think, was a question around the rule set. One said, so should we trust or should we not rely on the SAP standard rule set? And I think Jonathan's addressed that question, but just to reiterate that a little bit, typically speaking, we say that the standard SOD rule set is one that is a great starting point to use when you're going into an evaluation. But what it doesn't do, it doesn't include your custom transaction codes. And also over the top of that, it may also include rules that aren't relevant for your organization. So wanted to just knock that one out right now. And Scott, if there's another question about whether SAP supplies a rule set for sensitive access or other questions around the rule set, if you have a comment.
Sure. I think in terms of the rule set, there's a couple things there. One being that, as Jamie was saying, it's not always tailored to your business. So SAP did an excellent job of using SAP as an example, an excellent job for their rule set of gathering from multiple industries as well as all different types of functionality that's out there. And so in a lot of cases, there may be HR rule segregation of duties violations that don't apply because maybe your organization doesn't have HR installed. There's other instances where, for example, a particular industry requirement would drive a segregation of duties violation that might not be applicable. And I'd say a good example that we see sometimes is there was a rule a long time ago that talked a lot about the ability to one side of it being scrap raw material. Well, in a lot of cases in a production environment, scrapping raw material, not a big deal, but if it's high-value raw materials, such as a platinum or some other precious metal, then the ability to scrap that could become a significant issue. And so that's where we talk about, look at it as a great starting point, add your customizations to it in terms of what you've done in the environment, but also realize that not every one of those rules is going to be applicable, and that's the important part of the tailoring. SAP has provided a lot of those rules. They're available with the product, so I think there was a question around how to get a copy. They're part of the license agreement and available, at least with that product, as a download that comes with the software itself. And I think one of the other items was around some of the sensitive access. There is some guidance on some of the sensitive access actions that you would want to evaluate as well.
Okay, so we have thank you, Scott, we have the results of the polls that have come in. I think most people have opted for D, which we would see as being the correct answer as well, a mixture of the above. So there's a number of activities or areas that you go through in finding out how where your custom transaction codes are, and which ones of those are relevant to the rule set that you need to add in there. Jonathan.
Okay, so we've actually defined the customizing transaction codes as well as the standard transaction codes. So basically, the next objective is to identify the appropriate object values for those transaction codes. And what this is intending to do is to determine how a user actually executes a transaction end-to-end that actually constitutes that risk. So note that this is really important, as if it's not defined to an appropriate level, it may cause the rule set to over-report. So to do this, there's 2 steps to determine the appropriate object values. The first is to align the kind of technical definition of the function back to the defined object values. For example, if the function you're reviewing is create or change a purchase order, then you want to ensure that you have defined the technical activities 01, create purchase order, or 02, to change a purchase order, as you want to capture users who can do either. Further, you will want to ensure you do not have the activity 03 display the purchase order defined, as that will, as I mentioned before, cause kind of the over-reporting. So the second aspect is really determine whether there are any organizational criteria considerations. So basically, when defining an object value in the rule set, it works similar to a filter. If you define company codes, for example, you only see users who have access to the codes defined in the rule set. In some cases, you may want to call out a risk for a specific organizational area as more critical. As in this case, you may consider kind of tailoring those organizational values for that risk, and therefore reflect this within the organization. So basically, once you've actually determined kind of or aligned the object values from an organizational variable perspective, and also in terms of the activity or action kind of authorization object values, then that kind of completes your build of the rule set. Okay. So moving on to the So yes, moving on to the remediation and mitigation phase. So kind of back to the methodology. We have recognized the risks within the system and kind of converted these into technical rules. So the second phase, as I mentioned before, is to analyze the risk exposure to the environment. Running the reports, kind of evaluating and quantifying the results in terms of the number of security threats and the root cause of those threats. Then kind of based on these results, you want to initiate the remediation and or mitigation activities that are required to kind of remove those violations identified. The overall aim is basically eliminate the issues and get clean. This then needs to be sustained in the later phase of continuous compliance. So, and further to this, I mean, you should note that basically based on this analysis, the rule set may also require refinement to kind of remove the violations identified.
John, one of the things that I want to talk about too is that we haven't touched on is who's typically involved in this type of process, both phase 1 and phase 2, when you think about risk recognition and analysis. I know in my experience, you're going to have a lot of different groups represented to try and get a complete perspective across the organization. So representatives from the business, certainly from the finance organization, given the typical focus on financial controls, internal audit, internal control and compliance groups or SOX groups, if those are present, and then typically representatives from IT and system administrators if there's a tool that's being used. So really a collective effort to evaluate what the risks are and how to go through it, and different levels of integration as you work your way through the life cycle here.
And I think, Scott, it's Jamie. I just want to come in with, we've had a couple of questions that have been submitted around who should own this within the organization and what's the role of internal audit with this. And I think from my perspective, I mean, we see that the definition of segregation of duties and the risk need to be owned and managed by the business, and typically we see IT being the ones responsible for producing and managing and monitoring the actual process itself. And then internal audit, don't generally see internal audit own the process of segregation of duties, but responsible for reviewing it and assessing it to make sure that the risks of the organization have been met. So I wanted to just cover that whilst we were here, and if you had any other further comments on that.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree, Jamie, in terms of that being what we would typically see and definitely recommend on the majority of these efforts. It's typically supported by IT, but driven through the business.
Okay, thanks, Scott. So basically, kind of moving on, after the analysis was underway, the evaluation of the segregation of duties and sensitive access violations identified from the report, you need to kind of begin to recognize ways in which to kind of correct the conflicts and basically eliminate the issues. So typically, the number of violations, though, will be very high to begin with. This is because many people have kind of accumulated the access, and the tracking of changes has not been possible, especially if an automated product hasn't been implemented prior to this. So the following kind of describes the recommended approach towards remediation. And this is really to resolve issues in single roles, then resolve the issues in composite roles, and then finally to resolve issues in users. So in single roles, I mean, basically if the abilities or kind of conflicting abilities are triggered by a single role, you should really consider whether that ability needs to be assigned to that role. I mean, basically you might want to identify value reductions which can be implemented. This is such as kind of changing an activity from create to display, or remove the inappropriate abilities and kind of place them into another role. Alternatively, if the abilities should be contained within a single role, then consider mitigating controls, which we kind of address later. And then basically, the next step is resolve issues in composite roles. So this is where an ability or kind of the conflicting abilities are triggered by multiple single roles in combination to a user, or, for example, via a composite. So basically consider whether this should be able to whether these two roles should be removed, or whether one should be removed from the user. Kind of simulate the removal of transactions in one role, alternatively, to determine whether or not it will kind of eliminate the risk. So, and then again, if the abilities should be assigned, then evaluate whether value reductions, such as kind of changing the activity as I mentioned, and then there's also the mitigation approach. Then the final element is kind of resolving issues in the assigned access to users. So this is kind of prior to recertifying the user assignment to roles. Ensure all corrections have been implemented to the roles and user level reports. Or user-level reports. So this will will basically need to consider whether the user should be able to perform the ability or combination abilities that are violating the risk. Okay, so we need to move on to a poll question. So I'd like to hand. Okay. Yeah.
So the question we have now, has your company customized or tailored your rule set to reflect the risks in your environment? Number one, yes, the rule set has been tailored. Two, no, we haven't yet customized the rule set. 3, we do not have a tool or method implemented to monitor segregation of duties and sensitive access. And again, I'm going to quickly answer some of the questions that have come up. I'll take the really difficult question. Somebody had asked what GRC is. It stands for Governance, Risk and Compliance. I think we covered that up front, but apologies if we did not. Somebody also asked if we're sharing the presentation. Again, that was covered earlier on, but there is a widget for resources, and this presentation can be downloaded from that. If you're unable to download it at the end of the presentation, there will be both or Scott, Jonathan, and my email addresses, and you can email either one of us directly, and we can pass that on if you so desire. So, Jonathan, very technical question. Okay, so the results of this survey question, it seems like the majority of people have actually tailored the rule set, which is good news. No, we haven't customized the rule set. Again, I think we covered that during the last question about concerns we would have if we're looking at that as to whether you've really and truly identified all of the components of segregation of duties that you need to be looking at, or whether you are sort of placing inadvertent reliance on a standard rule set. And then C, obviously, if there's no tool, that makes it very, very difficult to effectively monitor and manage segregation of duties within the organization.
Okay, so the next stage is the mitigation element. So following remediation and basically the removal of access to users, mitigation is required, and this is basically regardless of the remediation options selected. As what we tend to typically see is fully restricted access is not always feasible. For example, a business unit may be too small to segregate duties. For example, a small purchasing department, and the users must have the ability to kind of create and approve purchase orders for the business to function. Therefore, to kind of cover this residual risk of a segregation of duty or sensitive access risk being violated by a user, alternate controls need to be designed and implemented. So taking this example, the segregation of duties control is to kind of separate the ability to release and approve a purchase order, and the risk really is that a user can create and approve a fictitious purchase order for kind of fraudulent gain. So to mitigate, management is the management review of all purchase orders entered by those who have that violation. For example, say 2 purchasing clerks, and thereby kind of covering the residual risk. So to actually mitigate, there is a recommended kind of approach to kind of define and develop mitigating controls. Really, again, my preference is this workshop approach, and this should be kind of initiated to collaborate on the assessment of risk and the development of kind of the mitigating controls to cover that residual risk created from the provisioning of access. So example items which should be kind of considered during these workshops are kind of the SOD and SA risk statements, kind of the business reasons for provisioning access or the remediation alternatives rejected. Also, furthermore, alternate controls to be implemented should be considered. These alternate controls, which is kind of the key to the workshop, can be the utilization of existing controls or, for example, the creation of new controls. And then kind of, again, collaborating with individuals with a variety of experience and knowledge adds value to the assignment of mitigating controls, avoiding kind of the redundancy of developing new controls and also supporting the accuracy of the risk to mitigating control mapping. Also, this is where you can even discuss the appropriateness of users being assigned that mitigating controls. So the real kind of how I to visually put what to consider from a mitigating control perspective is this diagram. And basically, this is where, as you can see, it's where you assess, is this truly a risk for compliance requirements? If no, then kind of this risk is redundant, should I say. It should be classified as either low or even no risk. But then if yes, then you need to determine whether controls are required. And as you can see, there's a scale from preventative to detective controls. So if preventative controls, so those controls which kind of prevent a risk from being applied, then if it's one of these preventative controls could be, for example, no intention to grant the access. So that means if there's no intention to grant this access, the risk is incredibly critical or sensitive, then there should be no mitigating control. At the other end, if the full detective control is implemented, so this is where management are reviewing every single kind of business transaction, for example, and there's no need to actually segregate or to restrict unsensitive access, then again, there's no need for for a mitigating control or even the risk, should I say, in the rule set. So really, what for the mitigating controls, you really need to look at scenario 2 and scenario 3. So this is where some users require access, but you want to limit, and also the remediation of access occurring. So this is where management intends to enforce the SOD, but most users have access. So this is kind of your medium risks we would associate with. And then these two kind of constitute for the mitigation process. So those kind of two scenarios that require a mitigating control to be in place to cover that residual risk of access. Okay. So on to the poll next. So Jamie.
So the last question we're going to be asking, in your organization, what type of mitigating controls are used the most? Preventative controls, answer number 1, or detective controls, answer number 2. And this will be our final poll question, so thank you for going through these. This will ensure your CPE credit is available to you. I think one question that I wanted to jump to whilst we're going through this, somebody had asked a question about they're entering an ERP implementation and what do we see as the approver of mitigating plans or roles, and how do we see internal audit play? And I think this ties to the question that we had before, but I wanted to address it in the context of a new implementation. I mean, we strongly recommend that if you're implementing SAP now, or even any of the other ERP systems, that you really look at controls and segregation of duties and sensitive access as a component of that. As you go through that blueprinting phase within the organization, it's important to have those controls designed into the to-be state and to understand how you're going to do that. And typically, as far as the implementation goes, we generally see most companies implement access control or a tool to manage that segregation of duties during that initial implementation, just because of the complexity to manage that afterwards. So I wanted to cover that just briefly during this. And as I said before, internal audit's role we see continuously going through this is to make sure that the risks that have been highlighted and are being addressed are the appropriate ones for the organization, and making sure that the implementation is covering that. So if we want to have a look at the answer to our last question. We're seeing a mix in the answers between preventative controls and detective controls, and I think we do tend to see that actually in reality. I mean, we do look at see if we can put preventative controls in place on the basis that does tend to be a much higher coverage, but it is typical that we see a lot of detective reports and stuff being used as well.
Okay, so back to the methodology. Kind of following the remediation and mitigation phase, we are now in essence clean. So now we need to implement controls for us to remain clean and effectively to manage the organization's ongoing exposure to risk from an access perspective. So the kind of the good practice in terms of continuous compliance. I mean, the first element is kind of change management. So this is kind of to ensure the ongoing accuracy and completeness of the rule set is to ensure it's aligned with business processes and also the security design, together with kind of maintaining the appropriateness of the rule set from a risk controls perspective. It is kind of recommended that change management process is implemented to control the changes. The kind of other element is the change management trigger. So as business processes, business risks and system functionality evolve and change, it is really recommended that control points are established within IT processes to kind of assess these changes, thereby determining whether or not they constitute a risk to the environment. From kind of an access perspective. And if so, then a change to the rule set should be initiated to capture the risk. An example here would be kind of the development of a custom program and its respective transaction code. Upon assessment of that transaction code for inclusion into the security design, a risk impact assessment should be performed to determine whether or not this needs to be reflected in the rule set. So the next element is mitigating controls, and we tend to see that these are validated on a periodic basis to ensure accuracy and appropriateness, specifically whether they are still key, whether they're still applicable and required for the organization, whether kind of the external preventative or detective control that is referenced has passed the internal or external audit. If not, then dependent on the deficiency, I mean, it could not be sufficient to cover the residual risk of an end user having that access. And also the final thing is to assess whether the users assigned to that mitigating control are still valid and appropriate. So the final element is, in terms of continuous compliance, is the governance and control integration. And the implementation can have a kind of significant impact on the access management process, and in particular on access as it preventatively and detectively restricts segregation of duties and sensitive access violations being introduced. So as such, kind of the recommended approach is in order to kind of integrate the tool or the processes, really the IT general controls and the processes focused on access management need to be kind of modified or retrofit with the new processes or control points. For example, leveraging this for the periodic access review. Alternatively, you can actually integrate this as a preventative check, during your user provisioning. So and the final element is really to obtain reliance around the tool. The tool or the process itself needs to be adequately controlled, and hence kind of the implementation of specific IT general control framework around this, which will govern access, changes to the tool, and the operations is also required. So, so Scott.
Yeah, I think with that really takes through the overall life cycle that we've talked through here, and the process from beginning to end, from defining your rule set to making sure you've got your own customizations in, all the way through to validating those risks, remediating against them, and then putting a process to stay clean. That's really the ultimate approach, and really wraps up a lot of what we were trying to cover here and what we outlined early on as the objectives. So, Jamie, with that, I think we'll hand it off to you. Jonathan, thank you very much for going through the detail.
Yeah, we're going to run for about 5 more minutes, so thank you everyone for bearing with us, and we will include another poll question at the end of that, just for anybody who hangs on. So, Jonathan.
Yes. Scott, did you want to take us through the case study?
Sure. There is one additional slide that we wanted to go through, which was a brief case study for those of you that are able to stay on. Just an example of a client that was putting in a segregation of duties tool, and in order to do it, one of the things that they found early on with what they had put in was that they had too many risks. So not only did they have too many, but they weren't customized. So they were getting reports on access violations that the business felt didn't resonate with them. They weren't true risks. They lost confidence in the ability for the tool to provide really accurate data, and saw it really as an IT-driven project. So all in all, it just did not have the right degree of implementation from a customizing of the rule set and risk identification, risk recognition, and that ultimately impacted their ability to get to the next phase, which was remediation. So when you think about the get clean aspect, they couldn't go to the stay clean because of the issues around the get clean. And so you see on the left side the before. What they did during is had a project to go through, and that's where the after comes in, which was customizing the rule set, as Jonathan really took you through, bringing the rules that they were looking at down by 50%, which is pretty significant, to about 150 risks, which is somewhere in the realm of what we would tend to see for a full-scale ERP. And a number of users that had violations, but ultimately it allowed them to go through the exercise to take care of about 85% of the violations that were out there. It was driven through the business, so you had business ownership and a sense of control over what they were looking at, supported by IT. So it was a collaborative effort, and internal audit and the compliance group was able to stay engaged as well. So there was complete transparency around what was happening. That's truly what the type of results we like to see, what we typically will recommend, and it's where you can really see the integration of both the IT and the business working together to accomplish the results.
So we're going to finish with this poll question, and then I'm going to do a wrap-up. So the final poll question, and it's worded a little bit interesting to hear, but really the question is, which IT area is not facilitated by the rule set? Is that change management, user access management, or computer operations? And I think just as we go through this final question before we wrap up, we did have a number of questions around security and security design, and that is a very, very complex question as to how we kind of consider best practices of security rule sets. And I'll hand over to Scott if you want to just sort of talk about, whether we sort of see standard roles or role-based or, task-based security.
Yeah, we generally we do see a little bit of everything when we go to the clients. We tend to lean towards a task-based model in terms of the underlying roles and what we'll call the building blocks that will form the access users will get. But the way in which that gets provisioned to users is where we tend to see differences. So that's where we'll see job-based approaches. That's where we'll see leveraging of automated provisioning systems and identity and access management integration that will allow you to drive a lot of the job role definition via those systems and avoid the maintenance that's required to support jobs within SAP. And again, it's going to be really different for a specific organization, the functionality that you're using, the use of HR, how the org structure is set up, and the technology that's in place, as well as some of the policies and the compliance aspects that are required. So we typically do like to see the foundation as task-based. It does drive SODs as low as possible in the design, which is always our goal, and allow violations at the user level where we can control it. We can either mitigate it or we can remove it. So that tends to be what we see.
Okay, thanks, Scott. That's fantastic. So just this final poll question, and we'll wrap up. So computer operations was the majority of what people answered, and that is indeed the answer to what isn't facilitated by the rule sets in segregation of duties. So I think the slide I want to talk to is just talks about the fact that we've got a series of these. I mentioned this up front. Our next webcast will be on April the 9th and is looking at maximizing the use of your system using SAP data to understand and optimize your processes. So really focusing on how do we do SAP optimization, how do we get more benefit out of our SAP investment. So looking forward to that one that's coming up. There are other topics there below, and obviously would welcome any thoughts that you've got to submit by questions. Or if we go up to the prior slide, we have the email addresses and contact details for Scott, Jonathan, and myself if you want to reach out to us directly. And the last thing I will close with is just a reminder that in order to get CPEs, you need to click the CPE widget at the end of this, located at the bottom of your screen, and follow the subsequent prompts to print your certificate. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining, and thank you for bearing with us as we ran a little bit over our allotted time there. Really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join us for today's webcast. Thank you.